The afternoon heat hung over the street like a heavy blanket, pressing against the buildings and slowing the rhythm of the city until even the air itself felt exhausted. Daniel Kofi Mensah stepped out of the small roadside shop with a bottle of water in one hand. His shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows as sweat gathered quietly along the edge of his neck. The traffic nearby moved with restless impatience, motorbikes weaving between cars while the distant noise of market vendors drifted through the humid air. It was an ordinary afternoon in a place where ordinary moments rarely announce the quiet turning points that would later divide a life into before and after. Daniel paused near the edge of the pavement as he twisted open the bottle, lifting it slowly to his lips. That was when he noticed the man sitting beneath the shade of a faded street sign. The figure was easy to overlook, the kind of presence that most people unconsciously train themselves not to see. His coat looked too heavy for the heat, the brown fabric faded and creased as though it had carried years of dust within its threads. His sandals were worn almost flat, and his thin hands rested loosely on his knees as he watched the movement of people passing by with the quiet patience of someone who had learned that the world rarely stopped for men like him. Daniel might have continued walking if not for the man's eyes. They were not the dull eyes of defeat that Daniel had come to associate with many people who lived on the streets. They were alert, studying the world with a strange, calm intelligence that made Daniel slow his steps without quite understanding why. The old man's gaze lifted, meeting Daniel's for only a brief moment. There was no begging gesture, no extended hand, no desperate plea, just a silent acknowledgement before his eyes returned to the movement of the street. Something about that quiet dignity unsettled Daniel in a way he couldn't explain. He stood there for several seconds, the heat pressing against his skin while traffic horns echoed somewhere behind him. The memory rose unexpectedly, sharp and unwelcome, like a shadow he had tried to outrun for years. 15 years earlier, there had been another man sitting on another street corner. Daniel had been younger then, rushing somewhere he believed was important, brushing past the stranger who had called out weakly for help. Daniel had not even stopped to look. By the time he returned hours later, the man was gone, and someone nearby had whispered that he had collapsed from exhaustion. Daniel had never confirmed the truth of that story, but the possibility had settled into his conscience like a small stone he could never remove. Now, standing on this sun-drenched pavement years later, Daniel felt that same quiet tug of responsibility pulling at him again. He walked toward the old man. The beggar lifted his head slowly, watching Daniel approach without surprise. Up close, the deep lines across his face told stories of time and hardship, yet his posture remained strangely composed. Daniel crouched slightly so they were closer to eye level and held out the bottle of water. The old man studied the bottle, then Daniel's face, as though measuring the sincerity behind the gesture. When he finally accepted it, his voice was low and calm, carrying none of the desperation Daniel had expected. He murmured a simple thank you before taking a slow drink. For a moment they sat in silence while the world rushed around them. Daniel found himself speaking almost without thinking, asking how long the man had been sitting there. The old man answered carefully, explaining that the street had many stories if someone had the patience to watch it long enough. The response was unusual enough to make Daniel smile slightly. They spoke for only a few minutes before Daniel eventually stood again. Before leaving, he placed a small folded note beside the man's bag. The old man did not immediately look at it. Instead, he watched Daniel walk away through the afternoon heat, his thoughtful eyes following every step. Across the street, Daniel's friend Samuel leaned against a parked motorcycle, shaking his head with a quiet laugh. Samuel had been watching the entire interaction and could already guess what had happened. He crossed the road with the easy swagger of someone who had known Daniel long enough to predict his behavior. Daniel asked why Daniel kept doing this, helping strangers who would likely disappear from his life within hours. Daniel gave the same answer he always gave, though this time his voice carried a softer weight. He said sometimes a small moment could change a life. Samuel scoffed lightly, though there was no real cruelty behind the gesture.
He warned Daniel that the world was not as simple as he wanted it to be. Kindness, Samuel insisted, was often wasted on people who had already chosen their path. Daniel did not argue, but as they walked away from the street corner, Daniel could not shake the strange feeling that the old man's quiet gaze had lingered longer than necessary. Behind them, beneath the faded street sign, Ibrahim Souleh finished the last sip of water and carefully placed the empty bottle beside him. Then he slowly unfolded the money Daniel had left. For several seconds he stared at it, his thoughtful expression deepening. Around him, the afternoon traffic continued roaring through the street, unaware that something subtle and irreversible had already begun to unfold. Ibrahim gently folded the money again and slipped it into the pocket of his worn coat. Then he lifted his eyes toward the direction Daniel had disappeared. A faint, almost invisible smile touched the corner of his mouth, because the man who had just helped him did not yet understand that their lives had already crossed once before, and the truth waiting ahead would soon force both of them to confront a past neither of them had fully escaped. And when that moment finally arrived, the simple act of helping a beggar on a hot afternoon would reveal a story far more complicated than Daniel could possibly imagine. Daniel did not think about the old man that evening, at least not at first. Life had a way of reclaiming attention quickly, especially in a city that never allowed its residents the luxury of long reflection. The sun had dipped low by the time Daniel returned to his small apartment, the air cooling just enough for the evening breeze to carry the distant sounds of street vendors packing up their stalls and children laughing somewhere down the road. Yet as the night quieted and the city quieted, the image of the old man beneath the faded street sign began to drift back into Daniel's mind with an unusual persistence. There had been something unsettling about those eyes, not the sadness Daniel expected to see in someone living on the streets, but a careful awareness, as though the old man had been studying him rather than simply accepting his help. Daniel had met many people in difficult circumstances over the years, and most carried either resignation or desperation in their gaze. But this man had looked at him with something different, something patient and deliberate. Daniel eventually dismissed the thought and went to sleep, not aware that somewhere else in the city, Ibrahim Souleh sat quietly on a wooden chair inside a modest room illuminated by a single hanging light bulb. The worn coat and sandals were gone. In their place, Ibrahim now wore a clean but simple white shirt and dark trousers. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. Without the dust and worn layers that had covered him during the day, the old man's posture seemed stronger, his presence more commanding. Across the small table sat a young woman whose resemblance to him was unmistakable. Amina Souleh leaned forward slightly, her braided hair resting over one shoulder as she listened carefully to her father's slow explanation of the afternoon encounter. Ibrahim described Daniel with remarkable precision, recalling the scar above his eyebrow, the thoughtful way he had crouched to meet him at eye level, and the hesitation that had flickered across his face before offering help. Amina listened in silence. For years she had watched her father repeat this same strange ritual. Ibrahim would disguise himself as a beggar and sit in different parts of the city, quietly observing the way people responded to someone they believed had nothing. Most walked past without noticing. Some dropped coins without making eye contact. A few offered words of sympathy that felt rehearsed and distant.
But every so often, someone behaved differently. Someone stopped. Someone truly saw him. Those moments had become part of Ibrahim's quiet search for something he believed the world was slowly losing: dignity. Yet this time felt different even to Amina, because as her father described the man who had helped him, a strange tension crept slowly across her face. She asked one question that caused Ibrahim to pause. Did the man have a faint scar above his eyebrow? When Ibrahim nodded slowly, Amina's eyes lowered toward the table as an old memory stirred painfully inside her chest. 15 years earlier, During a desperate afternoon that had nearly destroyed their lives, a young man had hurried past Ibrahim when he collapsed on a street corner from exhaustion. Amina had been there that day, kneeling beside her father while begging strangers for help. One young man had briefly looked in their direction before continuing to walk. Amina had never forgotten his face. Not out of hatred, but because that moment had forced her to understand something painful about the world, that many people simply chose not to see suffering when it appeared inconvenient. Now, as Ibrahim finished describing Daniel, a quiet realization settled over both of them. It might be the same man. But neither of them spoke the thought out loud. Across the city, Daniel awoke the next morning with the same strange restlessness still lingering at the edges of his mind. He couldn't fully explain why, but he felt compelled to walk past the same street corner again before heading to work. When he arrived, the space beneath the faded sign was empty. For reasons he could not explain, disappointment tugged faintly at him. Days passed, then weeks. Daniel returned to his routine, the memory slowly fading into the background of his busy life. Until one afternoon, nearly a month later, when something unexpected happened. Daniel received an envelope at his office. There was no return address, only his name written neatly across the front. Inside was a simple card with a short message. Sometimes, a small act reveals the truth about a person. If you have the time, come to the address below tomorrow afternoon. At the bottom of the card was an address Daniel did not recognize. Curiosity battled with caution as he stared at the message. Samuel immediately dismissed the entire thing as suspicious, warning Daniel that strangers rarely invited people somewhere without hidden motives. But something about the careful handwriting and the quiet tone of the message felt strangely familiar. Against Samuel's advice, Daniel went. The address led him to a modest but elegant building on the edge of the city, the kind of place that quietly signaled wealth without the loud display of luxury. A receptionist greeted him calmly and asked him to wait. A few minutes later, the door opened, and the man who stepped inside made Daniel's heart stop. It was the beggar from the street corner. Except, he was no longer wearing worn clothes or sandals. His posture was straight, his beard neatly trimmed, his presence calm and dignified. Daniel stood frozen, confusion spreading across his face. Ibrahim Sule walked slowly across the room and invited him to sit. The conversation that followed unfolded gradually, with Ibrahim explaining the unusual practice he had followed for years. He spoke of observing human behavior, of wanting to understand whether compassion still existed beyond appearances. But Daniel barely heard the explanation because another presence had quietly entered the room. Amina stood near the doorway, watching him with an expression Daniel could not immediately read. When their eyes met, something inside Daniel tightened. Her gaze carried recognition. Then Ibrahim revealed the truth that finally connected the past and present together. 15 years earlier, on a desperate afternoon when Ibrahim had collapsed from exhaustion, a young woman had begged strangers for help. Daniel had passed by that street. And the man he had become haunted by guilt over that memory for years. Silence filled the room as the weight of the revelation settled between them. Daniel felt the familiar shame rising again, the same guilt he had carried silently for half his life. But Amina's voice was calm when she finally spoke. She said something Daniel had never expected to hear. That moment had changed her understanding of people forever, but the man who helped her father weeks ago on the street corner had shown her something else entirely, that people could change, that compassion sometimes arrived later than expected.
The room fell quiet again. Because in that moment, Daniel realized something profound. The act that seemed small to him, offering water and kindness to a stranger, had unknowingly become the moment that rewrote a story 15 years in the making. Sometimes, the world returned unfinished chapters when people least expected it. And sometimes, redemption arrived disguised as an ordinary afternoon. But the most powerful truth was this: the beggar Daniel had helped had never truly needed the money. What Ibrahim Souleh had been searching for all along was proof that kindness still existed in a world that often pretended not to see suffering. And that day, beneath the faded street sign, Daniel had unknowingly given him the answer. So if this story moved you even a little, take a moment to think about the people you pass every day without noticing, because the next stranger you choose to help might be carrying a story far greater than you imagine. And if you believe the world needs more moments like this, make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that remind us what humanity still looks like when someone chooses to care.